fiction, who isn't. Those are important dimensions of a Weberian process of exclusion and monopolization, which is traced back to Weber rather than primarily to Marx. I think there's an important conversation between Bourdieu and Norbert Elias, which would be very interesting. A conversation between Bourdieu and Nancy Fraser, the political theorist Nancy Fraser, and a conversation between Bourdieu and E.P. Thompson. Bourdieu, at different points, is a big fan of E.P. Thompson's, which is, of course, interesting, because E.P. Thompson was a role model for many Marxist historians at Witz and elsewhere in the 1980s. And Bourdieu sees, just as Bourdieu sees other people as versions of himself, he kind of seems to see Thompson as an early Bourdieu. And there's some reasons for that. And there is also, the fact that Bourdieu taking Thompson seriously points to the fact that there is he certainly acknowledges at some points the possibility of subordinate classes drawing on senses, or drawing on having dispositions which allow the possibility of revolutionary action, as Thompson would put it. And of course, I think in the South African context, the conversations that have been really rich would be conversations between Bourdieu and scholars of race. And the most obvious candidates in the South African context are between Bourdieu and Biko. And it'll be a really interesting conversation. And there's a whole lot of other conversations which Bourdieu could have with social psychologists around the way in which race is internalized into our dispositions if we live in racially divided societies. Those would be important conversations to have, and I think they would illuminate lots of the aspects of social theory besides Bourdieu himself.
Yeah, Virginia, where's Virginia Cliff, publisher? Veronica. Sorry, Veronica. There's a book here in the making. It's called Conversations with Bourdieu Mark II. The author is Jeremy Seekings, and he wants to focus it on Weber. Michael, for very good reasons, focused on Marx because he's a Marxist, and he wants to understand some of the problems with Marx and also with Bourdieu's understanding of Marx and the way in which it relates to it. One could, of course, be crude and say that the problem with Bourdieu is that his reading of Marx is through Weber, and add that the problem with Weber is that a lot of his understanding comes from Marx, really, and some misinterpretations. But that's for Jeremy to sort out in his wonderful new book that he's going to write for us. I just want to pick up on a couple of things earlier. Michael asked the question about whether or not distinction could be applied to an American situation. The book has, of course, been used to write quite a substantial, to prepare a very substantial piece of research on culture in the UK and culture and class in the UK, put together by a team led by Michael Savage. And I thought the findings were really quite interesting because there were no clear homologies of the kind that Bourdieu talks about. But what was found is that particularly at the upper end of the occupational structure, the senior managers, senior professionals, and so on, there was a clear domination of class, not of the kind that Bourdieu talks about, but what's referred to as of being cultural omnivores. In other words, upper classes just absorb lots of different kinds of culture. What they're interested in is not very different from what working class people are interested in, although it turns out working class people are more interested in eating fish and chips. But there are very few things which distinguish the working class from the kind of upper middle classes. It's just that the upper middle classes do lots and lots and lots of it. In other words, I think they've got the resources to do this. Now, I haven't examined this properly in South Africa, but a little bit of the research that we did in Soweto suggests something similar. In other words, that if you're well off, you can do all sorts of things. You can go to the movies, go to the theatre, go to a restaurant, listen to any music you want to. If you're poor, you can't do these things. In other words, in South Africa today, there is an association between relative well-being and the kind of culture which you enjoy and can begin to participate in. Some of the discussion has been about continuity and change. Well, I kind of feel like saying, well, of course, continuity and change. I mean, why wouldn't there be continuity in South Africa? So much has continued. We still have a vast majority of the population who live in poverty, who suffer from all sorts of attacks on the way in which they live their lives, who still live in rotten conditions without decent services. It's no surprise that people rebel, and they rebel using the same kind of methods that they have done in the past. It's certainly no surprise to me, and certainly you can see it in very obvious kinds of ways. In Balfour, where I've done some research, it's the same bloody shops being burnt down. People are putting the barricades in exactly the same places they did in the struggle against apartheid. So there's certainly those kind of repetitions in terms of the repertoires. Of course, some things have changed. Inequality is worse. Poverty is worse than it was under apartheid. And these are the things that we need to take on board, not in terms just simply of trying to unpack the details, which Carl is absolutely superb at, but in trying to understand what might happen in the future and trying to think about the way in which the future might be shaped by ideas and by organisation and so on. Now, clearly there are some other differences which are positive. There's a whole social welfare system which has been developed, which Jeremy in particular has written about. And somehow, I think as social activists and social theorists today, we have to work out the relationship between these two things. And I think Bourdieu may be of some value here. You know, he talks about the left hand and the right hand of the state. How do these two things work, and how are they affected by the variety of different pressures that we've discussed? But I do think, if we're going to talk about violence as part of this media, a range of different things that we have to take on board, then we have to break it down. One of my criticisms of Carl, and we debated it before, and I'm loath to say anything now, is the tendency to compress different kinds of violence into one category. And I agree very much with what Dimitri was saying. The question is whose violence? Because whose violence is also related to the extent of violence, the sheer brutality of the violence that's involved. And here I do want to kind of urge people to read Sarah's book, because she's got this harrowing detail in it of young people who use violence against their grandparents, usually their grandmothers, just in order to get some of the resources from their pension. Now, how do we understand this? How do we interpret this? This is violence, in a sense, subordinate violence between ordinary poor people. But if we're to understand it, we have to start by talking about the violence of poverty that people live in. Why should people be in a situation where they're dependent upon pensions? Why should we have young men, young women who've got no resources whatsoever that they can make use of, unless they can rob their grandparents? So I think we need to situate this violence, Carl, in a much larger framework and understand the different kinds of violence that exist in our society.
Thanks, Peter. We are concluding this session with concluding remarks starting with Mark and then Carl. Carl will give his 1 minute to Malcolm. Malcolm, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. All right. Well, first, this question of violence, I have nothing to say about it, but basically I think it's very important. So I think this formulation of the different types of violence, I think that's exactly the way to go. And I think Bourdieu offers us very little, and Fanon offers much more. As to this, I think Bourdieu has a theory of social change. He basically has a theory of social order, in which I disagree with Jeremy, in which, in fact, dominated, cannot understand the conditions of the domination because they are so absorbed in their material life. He has openings, possibility of change. When habitus feels clash, for example, when habitus is totally contradictory, he has the possibility of change, but not the theory of change. He has no theory of the consequences of clash in habitus and field. So I think there's an area there for Jeremy to develop. And also, I look forward to conversations. From many conversations with Bourdieu, that is the fascination of Bourdieu. And in fact, to have a conversation, or any theorist can have a conversation with Bourdieu. I don't know how it's possible, but it really, his opus lends itself to multiple conversations. The one person with this, Jeremy, is Durkheim. He is first and foremost a Durkheimian, in my view. And most of his ideas of symbolic domination come from Durkheim. Let me say one thing about Weber. I have to say this because he's not a Weberian in one page, and he's explicit about this. His critique of Weber, basically, Weber does understand the recognition, but basically he hasn't a concept even of false consciousness. That you can read Pascal's Expectation. I've been looking at here. And that's what he said about Weber on 2 and 310. And basically, the idea of legislation. That's the advantage of being at home in front of my books.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me end with what I was supposed to start with and congratulate both Michael and Carl for producing something very outstanding. It's produced by Wits Press, and therefore Wits Press will have the last say.